Good morning, biology babies, and welcome to a new week and a new area of study. So we are completing area of study 2 now for Unit 3. And never has it been such an important topic to be talking about and learning the basics for. So I mean, you might look back on this time in your life as being the inspiration point for your passion area and learning about what was going on in the world at this time, and wanting to know more about what we can do to help to educate ourselves and maybe be involved in research in the future that's going to help change the world from this very weird state that we find ourselves in currently. So the topic that, of course, we are talking about is the immune system, um, how infection occurs, how pathogens infect the body, and just how the body communicates to defend itself. So it's a huge topic and it's of such great interest at the moment. And there's so many additional resources that you guys can be looking up and looking into. And we'll start sharing some of those along the way that we're finding interesting ourselves. So let's start with the basics and we'll start at the start. All right. So looking into chapter 6 to begin with. And it's all about the basics of cell signaling. So, how does the body communicate between different cells and different tissues? Let's just get me out of the way here. I'll have to move me around. And we're starting by, in 6.1, looking just at this first dot point. So this week, this is our big focus. The sources and modes of transmission of various signaling molecules to their target cell, including plant and animal hormones, neurotransmitters, cytokines, and pheromones. So we're going to check off all that knowledge this week, and then next week start moving into looking at the stimulus response model and how different signals are received differently by cells, and how they're responded to. And as an example of that, looking at something called apoptosis, regulated cell death, which is something that you may be familiar with from past studies, and problems with apoptosis. The cat's decided that this is a good place to sit. I'll just sort him out and I'll be back. All right, obviously can't sit anywhere too comfortable, or he interrupts. So let's get into 6.1. All right, now this diagram looks crazily complicated, and the only reason I've got it there is just to reiterate what I was saying earlier. This is such a huge area of study at the moment in the world, and this is why. So I've just picked this diagram as one to show how complex cell signaling is. So from these 5 signals that are being received by this cell, and you'll learn a little bit more about details of something related to this later, but it creates all of these events that are taking place inside the cell. So a signal is received, and then you just think of all of these as enzymes. All of this enzyme activity is generated inside a cell, and outcomes are achieved. So looking at this picture maybe gives you an idea of how huge the area is that they're looking at the moment of drug design for coronavirus. So they need to know what signals are being received by cells, how the virus is creating infection, what it's instructing body cells to do, and are there enzymes that are present in any of these pathways that they can target to stop the activity of? So in all of these various ways, we might be able to target one enzyme along the way that will stop the infection, stop the activity of that virus. But there's so many options. And for any one of these, you would need to know how it functions, what its active site looks like. Can we design a molecule that stops the binding of the substrate to that enzyme? And all of that is something that you're familiar with the basic knowledge for already with our work in chapter 4. So that's the scenario that's being faced by scientists at the moment is something even more complex than this. And can we find somewhere in these pathways that that we can halt the process, that we can stop the infection from occurring? So it has big world applications, the stuff that you're learning in this chapter. All right, but we need to start somewhere. You need to start with basic understandings first. So looking at just terminology to begin with, we're going to start by talking about how cells communicate and how they work to tell a tissue somewhere else in the body or right next door to it how to act and behave and what to do. There's 3 words that we want to get used to using. That is autocrine, paracrine, and endocrine. So autocrine refers to when a cell is targeting itself or like cells of the same type that are nearby. So auto, is self. So that's a bit of a clue in that word, but targeting itself or cells of the same type. Paracrine is signaling that's taking place locally. So we've got a signal being released from a cell and a cell nearby is the target cell. So it hasn't got far to go. That signal's being received in the same local area. An example of that might be where you've got a neuron releasing a signal that is targeting an effector, perhaps a muscle cell right near it. That would be paracrine signaling. And then endocrine, which is one that we're going to look at in a lot of detail, is where we've got a signal being released and it's traveling a great distance to its target cell through bloodstream. So this would be where we're talking, and we're going to get into talking about hormone action and how hormones are released from a gland, a cell within a gland, and then they travel through the bloodstream a great distance to the target cell that needs to receive the message and make a change in the body. Okay, and so we're going to talk about 2 major classes of signaling and compare them. The endocrine system signaling, so the activity of hormones, and we're going to compare that to signaling in the nervous system. So if we start with the endocrine system, here I say to know the names of the glands, even if you just pick a couple that you know the details of. And so if it might be the pancreas is a gland that releases insulin, which targets most cells to trigger them to keep that blood glucose in check. Or it might be the ovaries, which release follicle stimulating hormone, which can trigger cells to release estrogen. If you have a look in your textbook, we've got a big table here of different examples of different hormones that are being released from their gland. The hormone name, this one I'll talk about soon, what's its target and its function. So say growth hormone, which is being released from the pituitary gland, targeting bones and muscles to promote protein synthesis and growth. So I have a few examples up your sleeve that you could describe if you were ever called to. Okay, now another big concept idea in our understanding of hormones and how they work is this idea of hydrophobic versus hydrophilic. So hormones can be either hydrophobic or hydrophilic, And being able to identify whether a hormone is one of these two categories is usually the base idea behind a lot of exam questions that you get asked about hormones. So you'll be given a bit of a clue in the question about whether it's hydrophobic or hydrophilic, and then your description of how it functions, how it works, will change based on that idea. So just for now, remembering what those two words mean. So hydrophobic means doesn't like being in a water environment, but it does mean that it can cross the phospholipid bilayer very easily. Whereas hydrophilic loves being in a water environment. It does cause problems for crossing the cell membrane though. And we'll touch back on those ideas when we come to talk about 6.2. So just remembering your definitions for hydrophobic and hydrophilic and understanding that hormones can fit into one of those two categories. As a general rule of thumb, hydrophobic hormones, a lot of the sex hormones, steroids, are hydrophobic hormones. So that can be a useful piece of information. Okay, so hormones can affect multiple cells only if they have the receptor. Hormones are what we call their transport is non-specific, but you can't say that a hormone itself is non-specific. So when a hormone is released, it's released into the bloodstream and it will travel throughout the body. So hormones that are intended for like we just talked about growth hormone being intended for muscle and bones, they're not just released to muscle and bones, they will be released to the brain. They'll be released everywhere in the body. However, their specificity comes from the fact that only their target cells will have the receptor to react to them. So that's our endocrine system. Its function is relatively slow, generally. There are some cases where a hormone response is quite quick, but generally the activity of hormones is a pretty slow and long-lasting effect. You've got two videos, which if you have a look at your style lesson for this week, those two videos are on there for you to have a look at and take some notes for. And I'll let you do that. And if we have a look at the nervous system now and do a little bit of a comparison to the endocrine system. The first thing we need to have nailed down for the nervous system is that the structure of its component, the neuron. So this might be something that you're familiar with if you have studied psychology or just from junior sciences. But if not, then it is something that you do need to have an appreciation of. So the way neurons are structured is it's end to end. So the cell body end of this neuron would be butted up to the synaptic terminal end of the neuron before it. And signaling will happen from neuron to neuron in a big long line that we call a nerve. Right, so the basic components, like every cell except for red blood cells, we have a nucleus where all your normal activities that happen in a nucleus would still be taking place. So there's still genes there that are going to be transcribed that are making and making instructions to go out and produce proteins that are required. So the same processes that take place in any cell that we've talked about before are still taking place inside this neuron. But we've got a few specialized features that you need to be familiar with. So number one, you've got coming away from what we call the cell body, the main part of the neuron where we find the nucleus, there's these projections that hang out the sides and they're called dendrites. On the dendrites, we find receptors, which are going to be important structures for us to talk about when we're in 6.2. Now, the long part of the neuron here we refer to as the axon. This is where the electrical signal that we'll discuss takes place. So the axon of the neuron. And around that axon, we find something called myelin sheath. And I can hear the psychology students already piping in and telling me straight away what the job of the myelin sheath is. Yeah, I can hear you. And you're saying that the myelin sheath is there to increase the speed and how well the signal travels through the axon. Myelin sheath becomes important later on in our study because we'll look at a case where it deteriorates. And if you lose the myelin sheath around the axon, then that's where you start interrupting electrical signals and disrupting the nervous system. So it is an important structure and it will come up later. So here we've got our electrical signal being generated along the axon, which comes to a close at what we call the synaptic terminal. This structure in particular has a few different names that it gets: synaptic terminal, synaptic knobs, something buttons. There's a few different names that we give this one. I try to stick to synaptic terminal. Synaptic because there's a label that's probably missing from this diagram, and that is what we call the space in between this neuron and the next one along. So if you can imagine that there's another cell body with its dendrites sitting over here, and there's a bit of a gap junction in between the synaptic terminals and the dendrites, and that is called a synapse. So in between one neuron to another, we have a space called the synapse. Okay, so that's our basic structure for our neuron. How the signal works, the basics just for now, it's much quicker. So the electrical signal being generated along this neuron is a lot faster. He's interrupting again. Is a lot faster than what we see in the endocrine system. And the effects, to compare to the endocrine system, the effects are a lot shorter. So if you're to touch something hot, the message is received really quickly that a response needs to happen, and your muscles will move your hand away from that hot plate very quickly. But you don't keep that movement going, so your muscles don't keep twitching and moving, so the duration is really short and the message is very fast. And so you've got a table to fill in your style lesson to compare the two systems that we've talked about, the nervous system with the endocrine system. The mode of transmission, so how does it get around the body? What is that signal called? The release, I didn't actually include that in your table. But your target cells, no, I don't think I included that either. Speed, definitely. So can you compare whether the nervous system and endocrine system is slower or faster, and how long do the effects of each last? All right, and in all of this, we cannot forget about our plant hormone friends. Oh, actually, before I get onto the plant hormones, let's just take a quick backtrack because there's a little bit more to animals than I've included there. So if we could just go back and have a look at our key knowledge and see how we're going. We've talked about signaling molecules, what a target cell is. I'm going to talk about plants soon. We've talked a bit about hormones, we've talked about neurotransmitters, cytokines. Now, cytokines is what's missing. So cytokines, if you have a read in your textbook, just have a quick look at where to find it. All right, cytokines are talked about here. And it's definitely something that comes up again later on as we start exploring the immune system further. But cytokines are these these signaling molecules specifically that act in the immune system. So they act by signaling different cells of the immune system to initiate their activity. But just as an introduction to cytokines, understanding that their work is in the immune system. And then pheromones are this special example of signaling molecules where instead of signaling internally in the organism, the signal is being dispersed to other organisms. And that can happen through any medium. So across air, if we're talking about insects, fish release pheromones. So sometimes the medium can be water. But it's signaling from one individual of a species and is usually received only by members of that same species to communicate something to other individuals. And that might be responses that require aggression. You might be familiar with that when we observe the behavior of wasps in particular. They can secrete a pheromone that triggers others in their swarm to attack. Alarm, so ants can signal to each other to find food for one, but to disperse if there is a need to. And definitely we've heard of pheromones being able to attract mates in the animal kingdom as well. So that is our cytokines and pheromones, which you kind of just need to check off that you understand what those are. And definitely having a read through your textbook is always going to give you a bit more detail around those two ideas. All right, and that leaves us to get down to our plant hormones. Plants, classically, they're, for me, it's a hard one to retain. So there's 5 examples of plant hormones that you should be familiar with. Ethylene I'll come back to in a minute because that one tends to be an important one that gets asked about often. But these ones, so gibberellin, auxin, cytokinins, and abscisic acid, these hormones you do see asked about in VCAR exams, and it's always just this tiny little bit of knowledge that's being tested, and it's a top end sorter. So if you have those tiny little pieces of knowledge that you can call on, then you're gonna be able to get that 1 extra mark in a multiple choice question, or the one marks short answer question that's gonna just put you over that line. So print this photo off and have it up on the back of your toilet door, and just try to remember what each of those enzymes, or what each of those hormones, in plants are doing. Now, actually one more, cytokinins, don't confuse the word with cytokines. They're so similar, and I've seen people confuse them before, but they obviously have very different activities. So try not to confuse those two. Okay, ethylene gas. This is a favorite one to talk about, and they do pick on ethylene often to see if you know what it does. So ethylene behaves like a pheromone. It is released from a fruit, and it triggers ripening of other nearby fruits. So this fruit development action of ethylene is what we're interested in. One of your tasks this week is that we would like you to design an experiment that tests whether this is true. So does ethylene gas from a banana increase ripening of? Now I've got a pear here, but I mean, whatever fruit you have that you feel like you could test this on, it might just be other bananas. But this is something that we figure you've got these things at home, or you can easily get them. So if you don't have bananas and there's no way you can get a banana to do an experiment with, then that's fine. I still want you to have a go at designing the experiment. So writing up your aim, hypothesis, what all these variables would be, how are you going to measure your dependent variable. I want you to have a go at designing an experiment for this. So at the very least, you'll have your experimental design mapped out. You can come up with some hypothetical results and give me a really short discussion conclusion. It doesn't have to be anything overly detailed. But if you do have some ripe bananas at home, I'd be really interested to see you come up with and actually conduct your experiment this week. So, does ethylene gas from a banana increase ripening of whatever fruit you have laying around? Once you've got that written up, there's a space in your style lesson to upload it, and I will have a look and give you some comments on that. All right, the other task that you have set for the week is completing some worksheets out of your workbook. So, worksheet 13 and worksheet 14. Now, once those are complete, there is an upload function again on the style lesson. If you can take a photo of your worksheets and pop them on there, that would be fantastic. I am mindful of the fact that some people may not have their workbooks with them and that there was already during the first term some issues with people having a workbook. So I will scan the two worksheets and upload them to both Compass and Style so that you can access them. Okay, I think that is it on the theory side of things. You've got plenty of work to get through this week, and I am going to be available on our team's chat if you have questions. All right, good luck, and I look forward to talking to you during the week.